All right, so this is the remediation ed puzzle. So if you didn't do too hot on the quiz on Friday, hopefully you're watching this to try and get some help and improve your score. So these first batch of questions, they're asking for you to give the equation of the graph in vertex form. So by now, I would hope that you know what vertex form is, and if you don't, here's what it is. It's y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. The vertex is always h comma k, all right? And the vertex is always the minimum or the maximum of your parabola. So let's go ahead and try number 1. So for number 1, first thing we want to do is find the vertex, and that's always what you want to do. You always want to find that vertex. So I'm looking there, I can see that my vertex is 2, 0. If you have a hard time finding points on a graph, remember, it's always side to side and up and down, right? Or x, comma, y. All right, so we went 2 to the right and 0 up or down. So our point there is 2, 0. Next thing you're going to want to do is find another point to plug in. You need a vertex and a point on your function. All right, so we've already found our vertex. Now the point on my function I'm going to plug in here, I chose 4, 4. Could you pick a different point? Yes, but that is the point that I picked. You also could pick this point, or this point. It does not matter which point you pick, as long as you pick a good point that is not the vertex. So now we're going to go ahead and plug into this vertex form. I'm going to write out the vertex form again. So it's y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. Now one thing I want to point out is we don't know what a is, and that's what we need to solve for. So we're going to go ahead and put in our vertex. So we're going to plug in 2 for h and 0 for k. Remember how I said h comma k is our vertex. So we found our vertex, and we're going to plug it in there. Now we can also plug in our point. All right. Oops, sorry. Trying to find a different color here. We already did green. Come on, more. All right, we're going to plug in 4 for x and 4 for y. All right, so I'm plugging in my vertex and the point that I chose. So for my y value, I'm going to plug in 4. We get a. And my x value, I got 4. The h is 2. And my k is 0. So now we got to solve for a. We get 4 equals a times 2 squared plus 0. Now, when you're solving for a, this part always becomes the coefficient of a. So we end up with 4 equals 4a. We divide by 4, we get that a equals 1. So now when you give me the equation of a function, it should always be y equals, and then your a value, in this case it's 1, all right? Then we would do x minus our h, which is 2 squared, and then we had plus 0. Now the proper way to write this is we don't usually, when we have a coefficient of 1, we don't write it. So it would just be x minus 2 squared. And then when we have a plus 0, we don't write that either. So the answer here would be y equals x minus 2 squared. Your answer should always have the h, k, and a filled in. You leave the x and y out. All right, so let's go ahead and try another one. I'm going to do number 10 from the remediation assignment. Now, another thing I want to point out is if it is up like a cup, do you see how this guy is up like a cup? The a is positive. Okay, so let's say you solve this and you got a negative value for a. That means that it's wrong and you need to try it again. If you look at, let's say, number 5, this parabola opens down like a frown, which means that a is negative. So again, when you solve for, if you were to solve for this parabola, you should make sure that your a value is negative. If it's positive, you did it wrong. All right, so I wanted to go over number 10. So let's go ahead and try that one. First thing we do is find the vertex. My vertex here is -3, -5. All right. Let's go ahead and also find our point that we're going to plug in. I'm looking, I would say that a good point here would be this guy, which is -2, -3. So now we're going to go ahead and plug into our equations. We know we have y equals a times x minus h squared plus k. I'm going to plug in, actually I should show this. This, my vertex, is always my h, comma k. My other point is always x, comma y. All right, so the vertex always goes in as h, comma k. My other point is my x and y value. So now we're going to go ahead and plug these in. So my -3 is going to go in here. My -5 is going to go in for my k. My whoops, I wanted a highlighter. My -2 is going to go in for my x. And my -3 is going to go in for my y. So now let's plug all of these in. We get -3 equals a times -2. And then it's going to become a +3, right? We switch the sign of the h value. Squared minus 5. All right. If that confused you, how I got a +3 there, I'm going to write it out for you. So I did -3 equals a times x minus -3 squared minus 5. So what ends up happening is when you have a minus and negative, it's going to become positive. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and solve for a. I get -3 equals a times 1 squared minus 5. This guy becomes my coefficient. So I end up with -3 equals a minus 5. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. And I get that a is 2. So now I just need to go ahead and plug in into my equation. We're going to do y equals 2 times x plus 3 squared minus 5. All right. So that is how you come up with the equation of a function or of a parabola from the graph. All right, the next thing they ask us to do is to graph the equation. All right, so the first thing you want to do when you're graphing the equation is find the vertex. Also, one thing I would maybe recommend doing is pausing the video now and going to try these other problems from the first part where you're trying to find the equation. Since you just watched it, pause, go try those problems. All right. I'm going to keep going though. So now we have to draw the graph of this function. So first thing you always want to do is find the vertex. Remember, the x value switches the sign. So in this case, we get -3, -5 as our vertex. Remember that x value always changes. The y value stays the same. So then I'm going to put my vertex right in the middle. I get -3, -5. And I'm going to find 2 points on either side. So I'm going to do -4, -5, -2, -1. Now this is where you're going to want to go to Desmos. So let me go ahead and get to Desmos here. All right. If you haven't messed around with Desmos at this point, I would pull up 2 tabs right now and do Desmos with me to make sure you know how to do it. All right. So we're going to go ahead and plug this in. We're going to do y equals parentheses x plus 3, close parentheses, squared, minus 5. All right, so first off, I already have a graph, which is great and wonderful. All right, now I can kind of use this graph. I get kind of a sense of what my graph should look like, right? But now we're going to go ahead and get a nice table. So you're going to click on that little settings button that looks like a little gear, and then you're going to click on the table, and this should come up. Now you need to plug in the values of x that you want, right? And we said -5, -4, -3, -2, and -1. Just to reiterate, those are my points. So we're going to go back to Desmos and plug those in. So we're going to do -5 minus 2. Oh, I'm sorry, minus 5, minus 3. Oh my goodness, minus 4, I can't count. Minus 4, minus 3, minus 2, and minus 1. So now we have all of our y values. We can go ahead and plot these and put these points into our table. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Oh boy. What did I do? Here we go. Sorry, I lost my Apple Pen for a second, but I found it. All right. So now let's go ahead and put that into our table. So we're going to put in a -1, -4, -4, and -1. And I got those straight from Desmos. So now all we have to do is plot it. We're going to start at -3, -5, -2, -4, and -1, -1. And we end up over there. That's our -5, -1. And that is our parabola. All right. So that is how you graph a parabola. Please make sure you know how to use Desmos. All right. Desmos makes things nice and easy. So now, the next thing we worked on in the beginning of this unit was completing the square. All right. And the reason we had to learn how to complete the square is that is how you go from standard form to vertex form, all right? And I want you to remember on Canvas, I did post a cheat sheet that helps show you how to go from vertex to standard, standard to vertex. So if you go under modules, here I have the quiz cheat sheet. On here, it shows you how to go from standard to vertex, vertex to standard, all right? And I have examples there. So make sure that you look at this, you understand this, and that you know how to use this, because this is a great tool for you. All right, so now let's go ahead. I'm going to try number 1. So it says, write the equation in vertex form by completing the square. So I need to complete the square on this guy. So there's two kinds of completing the square problems. There's one where there's a leading coefficient and one where there is not a leading coefficient. There is no leading coefficient here. Okay, when the leading coefficient is 1, a positive 1, this is what it looks like, and it makes things a little bit easier. So the first step is to write it like this. We're going to do x squared minus 4x, close the parentheses, and add a 5 on the outside. Then what we're going to do is take the middle term, which is a -4. We're going to divide it by 2 and square it. So I end up with a -2 squared, which gives me a +4. Now, I know I've said this a million times before, but I'm going to say it again. When you plug this into your calculator, you have to use parentheses. If you don't, you're going to get it wrong. Okay? You have to use parentheses when you plug that in. So now, what we do is we have to write this guy as a perfect square. All right? So, the way you do that is it's always going to be x. And then if this is a plus, you're going to put a plus. If it's a minus, you put a minus. We're going to put a minus there. Then you take this number and divide it by 2. So 4 divided by 2 gives me 2. So I'm going to put a 2 there. Then I square it. Ooh, and I also forgot, right, since we added in the 4, we have to subtract out a 4, right? So then these guys we combine. So we're going to do 5 minus 4, which is going to give us a +1. And the square is completed. All right? So this is now in vertex form. You could easily tell the vertex of this graph would be 2, 1. All right? So that is how you complete the square when there is no leading coefficient. Now we're going to go ahead and try to complete the square with a leading coefficient. So if you notice here, there is a leading coefficient. We have a -3 in front of our x squared. So what we have to do is factor out that leading coefficient. So we're going to get a -3 x squared minus 16x minus 187. So you're probably like, how did I get a -16? That was a +48. Well, when you factor out this 3, you have to factor it out of both of the first two terms. So I factored it out of the x squared. I need to factor it out of my plus 48x. So I did 48 divided by negative 3, and that's going to give me my negative 16. All right, so now, once I get to this point, I'm going to go ahead and take my middle term, just like I did before, divide it by 2 and square it. So I get negative 8 squared, which is going to give me a positive 64. Now before, when there was no leading coefficient, we would just minus 64 on the outside. But we cannot do that, all right? Since we have a leading coefficient, we need to go ahead and multiply the leading coefficient and the number we just added in. So I ended up with a 64 times negative 3. I end up with a negative 192. All right. So I have to subtract that on the outside. So I get minus negative 192. All right. So now, since I'm subtracting a negative, it is going to become positive. So I end up with negative 3x squared minus 16x plus 64. And this becomes minus 187 plus 192. Since I was subtracting a negative, do you see how this was negative up here? It becomes adding. So now I'm just going to rewrite this guy as a perfect square. So I've got my minus 3. Since there's a negative there in front of the 16, I'm going to put a negative there. And I'm going to take my middle term, divide it by 2. I get 8. Then I combine these guys. I end up with a plus 5. And this would be my answer. Now, there is a way to check all of these. All right? What you want to do is take your the problem that I gave you, plug it into Desmos, and then plug in the answer that you got. Okay, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So the initial equation was negative 3x squared plus 48x minus 187. And you'll see that this is, right, looks kind of crazy. But that's okay. So that is our initial function. Now let's plug in the function that we got, which was negative 3 parentheses x minus 8, close parentheses, square that plus, plus 5. Okay? Do you see how this black graph went right on top of that purple graph? All right, do you see how I'm changing it? Those are the exact same thing. So that tells me I did it correctly. Let's say you ended up with something like this is your answer. Do you see how these are different graphs? That would tell you that you completed the square wrong and that you need to try again. All right, so let's go ahead and try number 8. So first thing we're going to do is factor out our leading coefficient. So we're going to take the 4 out. We get x squared minus 14x. I'm going to do my plus 200 on the outside. So first off, I factored out a 4 out of this first term, and I got x squared. Then I factored a 4 out of my negative 56. I did negative 56 divided by 4, and I got negative 14. So then I'm going to take my middle term, which is a negative 14, divide it by 2, and square it. So I get negative 7 squared, which gives me 49. So I'm going to add 49 on the inside there. The next thing I'm going to do is multiply the leading coefficient and the number I just added in. So I end up with 196, and it's positive. So I'm going to subtract 196 on the outside. Move that out of the way. All right. So now we're going to go ahead and write this guy as a perfect square. So I get 4x minus 7, right? Take that middle term, divide it by 2, square it. And then you're going to combine these like terms, which gives me a plus 4. So your final answer should look like this. So now would be a good time to pause the video And go try these completing the square problems. Try the ones without a leading coefficient and try the ones with a leading coefficient. All right, so now these last ones, they're asking you to convert to standard form. So what that means is that you're going to have to get it into y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. That's what your answer should resemble, okay? So let's go ahead. I'm going to do number 1 and number 4 from this page. So the first thing you need to do, this thing that is being squared, you have to FOIL it. So to FOIL, you're going to write it out twice, right? Because it's x plus 2 times x plus 2. We're going to go ahead and FOIL. We get our first term, which is x squared. We do our outer term next. Our outer term, which is 2x. Our inner term, which is 2x. And our last term, which is 4. All right? And then we still had that minus 9 on the outside. So then what we're going to do is combine like terms, x squared plus 4x plus 4 minus 9. I end up with x squared plus 4x, minus 5. And that would be my answer there. Now again, you can check your answer on this. So there's no reason you should get any of these wrong because you can literally check all of them. I'm going to go in and plug the equation I was given, and I'm going to plug in the equation that I found onto Desmos. So we'll go to Desmos. And I recommend you do this with me so that you make sure you know how to use Desmos. You end up with x. Oops, sorry, I don't know what happened. I thought I erased this. So you end up with parentheses, x plus 2 squared. Oh my goodness, what just happened? X plus 2 squared. There we go. Minus 9. All right, so that was the original equation they gave me. Then the equation that I got was x squared plus 4x minus 5. See how those graphs overlap perfectly, right? My black graph and my red graph are right on top of each other. That tells me I did the problem correctly. If you graphed it and they didn't match, you got to try again because you did it wrong. All right, now let's try number 4. So notice how number 1 did not have a leading coefficient, right? No leading coefficient there, right? But this one does have a leading coefficient. So pay close attention to how you do it with a leading coefficient. First thing you need to do is still FOIL this out. So I'm going to keep my minus 5 out in front. I'm going to do x minus 1, and then I'm going to keep my plus 2 on the outside. So let's go ahead and FOIL. We get our first terms. Now, one thing I want to point out, notice how I am keeping it in parentheses, okay? When you have that leading coefficient, you got to keep it in parentheses. So we do our first term, our outer term, which is minus x. Our inner term, which is going to be minus x. And then our last term, which is going to be plus 1. All right, so let's close this up, add a 2, and add in our negative 5 out in front. Then what we're going to do is combine the like terms in the parentheses here. So we get x squared minus 2x plus 1 plus 2. Then I'm going to go ahead and distribute this leading coefficient. I get minus 5x squared plus 10x minus 5, and then I still have my plus 2 on the outside. So I'm going to go ahead and combine like terms. I get minus 5x squared plus 10x minus 3. And that would be my equation in standard form. Now again, you could check this by graphing the first equation and the equation that you came up with.